Hello, I'm Tom Childers. Welcome to this set of lectures on the Second World War. It's just over 50 years since the guns fell silent and the instruments of surrender were signed, and the Second World War came at last to an end. 50 years, and yet we are still caught in its powerful thrall. Books, films, magazines, museums are devoted to the war and assault us from all sides daily, whether we live in the United States, in Great Britain, in Germany, Japan, or Russia. They summon us to remember, to bear witness to a momentous conflict that shaped the very contours of life in the 20th century. The complex of interrelated conflicts we call the Second World War is the most widely researched and exhaustively documented conflict in the modern era. And even so, its sheer scope is staggering. Between 1937 and 1945, we estimate, no one knows for certain, 55 million lives were consumed by the war, dead. Millions more were maimed, wounded, physically and mentally, or they simply vanished, were missing, never accounted for. The war was contested across all the world's oceans and seas, leaving few corners of the globe unscathed. It was fought in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and drew combatants from North America, Australia, and South Asia. It was, quite simply, the single greatest, largest event in human history. Its political consequences were profound. It fundamentally altered the balance of power in the world, leading to the eclipse of Europe and the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers. It ushered in the Cold War, the ideological and strategic hangover from which we've suffered until this very decade. And it accelerated the retreat of European colonial empires throughout the world, intensifying and in some cases even generating movements of national liberation. It was, like none before it, a total war, a people's war, leaving no element of society, regardless of which society, immune from its demands. It demanded the total mobilization of the nation's industrial, agricultural, financial, and human resources. And when it ended, it had brought fundamental economic and social changes in all of the combatant nations. After 1945, when the millions of veterans began returning home, people expected the states for which they had sacrificed and suffered to provide more in the way of health and homes and education. In Europe, the Second World War marks the real beginning of the welfare state, one of the most important social developments of the 20th century. Historians have devoted a great deal of attention to and can speak with some confidence about the diplomatic origins, the underlying causes of the Second World War. We know a great deal about the economic mobilization for war and the social and political consequences of the war. We have numerous works, and very good ones, about the war's major statesmen, Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, Hitler, Tojo, and so on. We have great works about the leading military figures of the conflict, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Rommel, Yamamoto, Chukov. These are important topics, key issues in understanding the war, and we will certainly address them at some length in these lectures. But there is, for my money, another dimension that we ought to explore and that we will explore. Until very recently, we've had surprisingly little about the actual experience of war, the soldiers, the workers, the loved ones left at home, how they experienced the conflict. And so in these lectures, we will examine the origins of the war. Why was it fought? The politics and diplomacy of the participants. What were their goals? And what were the military strategies they employed to reach their objectives? We'll attempt to explain the war's outcome. What did the Allies win? Could the Germans and Japanese have prevailed? We tend to overdetermine the outcomes of these things, but I think for anyone who lived through the war, the outcome was anything but obvious, and certainly at the very beginning. We'll look at the role of economics. There's a growing tendency, I think, to believe that we simply outproduced, the Allies simply outproduced the Axis, that economic production doomed the Japanese and the Germans from the very outset. Is this the case? We'll also look at the changes in culture and society, primarily in the United States, but in the other combatant nations as well. But in all of this analysis, we don't want to lose sight of, indeed we will not lose sight of, the grim reality that war is about fighting and about dying. It confronts us with the most elemental human emotions and experiences: love, loss, fear, courage, sacrifice, cowardice, cruelty. It reveals humankind at its stunning best, ordinary men and women called upon to and performing extraordinary feats of bravery, of devotion to duty. And it also confronts us with humankind at its barbaric, bestial worst. We think only of the great crimes of the Second World War to be reminded of that. In this regard, it seems to me the Second World War confronts us with a peculiar irony. It is, after all, what Studs Terkel called, in quotation marks, the good war, fought by the Allies to defeat the evil of Hitler's Third Reich and the militarism of Imperial Japan. But as time has passed, we seem to have come to the historical conclusion that the war, because it was fought for a good and just and even noble cause, that the fighting of the war was somehow itself ennobling, elevating, even glamorous. That the combat did not bring with it great agonies and sufferings, that post-traumatic stress syndrome, MIAs, POWs, were somehow unique features of the Vietnam experience. I think this is a view that subsequent generations of the war have, certainly not those men and women who actually lived through the war. But we have this, a kind of Vietnam syndrome, it seems to be, as we look back at the Second World War, and we have this sort of Mekong Delta-sized body of work about the Vietnam War, that the Second World War and the nature of it, what it meant in human terms, has somehow been lost. We want to address ourselves to that experience. And so in these lectures, we will try to probe the full range of wartime experiences. For the Second World War, for the meaning of the Second World War, not to see it not simply from the perspective of those who directed the conflict, but from the perspective of those millions upon millions who did not make policy or formulate strategy, but found themselves and their families caught in the great and terrifying machinery of war. Let's begin this odyssey then by turning our attention to the origins of the war in Europe, and especially the legacy of the First World War. 100 years from now, if there are people still around watching films from the teaching company or reading books and thinking about the past, we hope there will be, and they look back at our own troubled, star-crossed century, they may conclude that the two world wars of this century, in fact, constituted one great conflict, a kind of second 30 Years' War, like that of the 17th century, with a 20-year truce between the end of its first installment in 1918 and the beginning of its second in 1939. Now, certainly there are differences, important differences in motives, in objectives, in the nature of the regimes involved. The Soviet Union, after all, was not Tsarist Russia. The Third Reich was not the Imperial Germany of the Kaiser, and so on. There were differences in the means with which the war was fought, the nature of combat, the machinery, the technology, the weapons. And we will analyze those differences down the road in subsequent lectures. But it might be said with some justice that the origins of the Second World War in Europe are to be found actually in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace at Versailles, in the way the Great War, as the First World War was commonly called after 1918, was concluded. In the summer of 1918, the German public was led to believe that victory was within sight. There was light at the end of the tunnel. After 4 long years of suffering, enormous casualties, a mobilization of resources that had never been seen before in Europe, that the great offensive that the German army launched in the spring of 1918 was going to bring the long-awaited and ultimate victory of German arms. Information was tightly controlled. Censorship was in place in Germany, as it was in all the combatant countries during the First World War. And over through the course of the war, the public, despite the long lists of casualty figures in the papers, underneath the black iron cross that appeared with frightening regularity, there was the sense that the war was going very well. that victory was within their grasp. And certainly this last great offensive in the spring of 1918 was to be that victory that was going to deliver the ultimate victory to Germany before the impact of the Americans could be felt on the war in Europe. Then, in October, the High Command made a startling announcement. An announcement that Germany had in fact surrendered. The country was in shock. How could this be? How could it be that the offensive that was going to bring Germany and the Kaiser its victory had led instead to an armistice, that the Germans had asked for an armistice? The sudden collapse left many in Germany believing that the army had, at the last moment, been stabbed in the back, that some sort of combination of domestic enemies, left-wing social democrats, the Catholic Center Party, the liberal parties dominated the right wing in Germany believed by Jews, had somehow stabbed the victorious army in the back at the crucial moment, just as victory was within their grasp. That was the only possible explanation. After all, in 1918, in the fall of 1918, German troops were deep inside France. Russia had surrendered. The war on the Eastern Front had been won. We tend to think that Germany could not, and this is important as we think about the Second World War and the German invasion of the Soviet Union, that the Germans could not have prevailed, that somehow this was a great folly. But of course the German experience was they had triumphed on the Eastern Front in the First World War, at great cost certainly. But in 1918, the war in the East had been won. The peace had not been won. The Bolsheviks were running amok in the East. The Germans didn't know what to do, but they had prevailed. The war there had ended successfully. German troops were still deep inside France. Indeed, Paris was still within marching distance of the German lines. And Germany itself was untouched. Its industries were still intact. There was no foreign soldier anywhere close to the German frontier. For the German public, this was a triumphant Germany. And yet, suddenly, in November, an armistice had been signed, asked for by the Germans. The Kaiser had passed into exile in Holland, where he would be passed in 1940 by German troops on their way into Belgium. The war was over. And the proud German Empire, the greatest military power in Europe, possibly in the world, in 1914, had not only not seized their objectives, they'd apparently lost the war. And a revolution had been proclaimed, overthrowing the old imperial regime, and a democratic republic had been established by a coalition of social democrats, liberals, and the Catholic Center Party. The outsiders of the old empire were now the insiders. The world had been turned upside down. Then, in early 1919, the Germans were summoned to Versailles, to the ornate palace of the Bourbons just outside of Paris for the peace treaty. It was a convening of the diplomats of the combatant nations along the lines of the Congress of Vienna, which had ended the Napoleonic Wars a century before. The German representatives were summoned to Versailles not to negotiate. This would be no negotiated settlement, but rather to hear the terms of the victorious Allies. For their part, the Allies, after suffering 4 long years of untold casualties, were determined to weaken Germany and to provide for some sort of international system of collective security. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Clemenceau of France, Orlando of Italy, all came to the conference determined to make the world a safer place. This, after all, was the war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy. And for the Europeans, certainly, what this meant above all else was to find a way to provide for collective security and to weaken Germany at the same time. Germany, after all, had held Europe at bay for 4 years, came very close to winning the Great War, and now something simply had to be done. Woodrow Wilson arrived with a more idealistic agenda, certainly his idea that one of the causes of the Great War had been was frustrated nationalism, that what one needed was the national self-determination of peoples, allow the individual nations of Europe, the peoples of Europe, to have their own states, their own nation states, and that this would provide for some sort of stable peace. But they were all agreed that Germany somehow had to be weakened. They began with a series of actions. The first was to detach territory. The Germans simply had to lose something from the Great War. So a portion of Germany, of German territory in the east, was taken to create the new Polish state, which came into existence, a state which hadn't existed at the outset of the war. A Polish corridor established between East Prussia and Germany proper to give this new Polish state access to the sea. Meant that Germany had lost territory to this new successor state, as it was called, successor to the old Austro-Hungarian and German empires. Danzig, the largest German city in the area on the coast, the port city of Danzig, was to be given over to the League of Nations to administer. Memel on the Baltic was handed over to Lithuania. Alsace and Lorraine, the two provinces on the border of Germany and France, bounced back again to France in 1919. They had been taken from France by the Germans in 1871. So that territory in the west was lost. The mineral-rich, industrial-rich Saar region on the German-French frontier was also to be administered by the League of Nations for a period of 15 years. So these losses in Europe meant that the German state that would come out of the First World War had suffered significant territorial losses. They also lost territory in Silesia, a coal mining area in eastern Germany that was important to them. One doesn't usually think about this in terms of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, but Germany also lost overseas territories. The German colonies in Africa were distributed to the British and the French, while in the South Pacific, Japan would be the heir to Germany's South Pacific colonies. The Marshall, Gilbert, and Mariana Island chains were German. It sort of always strikes one, I think, as somewhat odd to think about a place in the South Pacific called Kaiser Wilhelmsland, but it certainly existed. There's the Bismarck Archipelago. And these island chains, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, the Marianas, went over to Japan as a result of the outcome of the Great War. In addition to these territorial losses, the Germans were also forced to pay reparations. All of the Allied victor states, particularly France and Great Britain, had begun the war as creditor states and ended the war as debtor nations. They had gone heavily into debt to the United States. We had loaned money to the Allies before our entry into the war, so that the British, the French, approached the Treaty of Versailles with the notion that and the Belgians as well, who had suffered under German occupation for the entire duration of the war, the Germans now were going to have to pay. Lloyd George had run a campaign just prior to the domestic campaign in Britain, just prior to the convening of the Versailles negotiations, in which he said they were going to make the Germans, he was going to squeeze Germany until the pips squeak. This was the so-called khaki election where Lloyd George talked a tough line about just exactly what they were going to extract from the Germans. The Germans were going to have to pay. There was no final amount set. It was in effect a blank check, but the Germans were going to be required to pay billions upon billions of dollars. This reparations issue would become, I think, the most poisonous issue in European politics in the interwar years, at least down to the early 1930s. Poisoning relations between France and Britain on the one hand and Germany on the other, and also complicating relations between the United States and its former European partners. For the Germans, what insult was added to injury, because not only was Germany forced now to pay reparations, but the Allies added a new clause to the treaty, the so-called War Guilt Clause. The War Guilt Clause was added as a justification for making Germany pay. Germany now was forced to accept full responsibility for the outbreak of hostilities in 1914. Now, there was a lot of difference of opinion about who was ultimately responsible and so on, But as far as the Treaty of Versailles was concerned, the Germans were responsible. There was a war guilt clause, and this was the basis for Germany's payment of reparations. So the loss of territory, payment of reparations, and then a series of military clauses were added to the treaty, which also were meant to weaken Germany's position. The great German army, this German army which had been the pride of German society, which had fought successfully for 4 years during the course of the war, was now to be reduced to no more than 100,000 troops, just enough to maintain domestic stability in Germany. The Germans were not allowed to have an air force at all. There were to be no tanks, no heavy artillery. The German army was to be stripped of its ability to make war. It was there to maintain domestic order, pure and simple. A German navy was certainly allowed to exist, but could have no more than 6 warships and, most important for the Allies, no submarines. The U-boats had been one of the great problems for the Allies during the war, and they were in no mood to tolerate the existence of this arm of the German military, so no submarines. All of these aspects of the treaty were bitterly resented by the Germans and would all become quite controversial during the course of the 1920s and early 30s. And many believed, in fact, almost before the ink was dry, that the treaty probably had been too harsh. And yet there's a curious thing about the treaty. There was no occupation of Germany. After 4 years of bitter combat on a scale that the Europeans had never experienced, the war ends. The Kaiser goes into exile, a new German government is declared, and there's no occupation. Allied troops were certainly sent into the Rhineland for a sort of temporary occupation, and then the Rhineland, this area of Germany west of the Rhine River on the border of Belgium and France, was to be a demilitarized zone, but no real occupation. There were no Allied troops marching off to occupy Berlin and so on. One of the major differences between the outcome of the First War and the Second. Finally, a system of collective security, seen as absolutely crucial, was to be provided for by a new institution. And this was one of the brain children of Woodrow Wilson, and that's the League of Nations. An international organization which would help to negotiate differences between the nations of the world, which would hopefully prevent the outbreak of great tragedies such as the war that the world had just endured. So the League of Nations would be present to mitigate trouble after the end of hostilities. But this wasn't going to be enough. The French in particular were concerned. After all, the Germans were still just across the river. What were they going to do? The English could go back across the Channel, the Americans could drift off back across the Atlantic, but the French had the Rhine, and that was it. And so for the French, and this is the underlying story of French policy through the 1920s and into the 1930s, is a search for security. There were still 20 million Germans too many, as far as the French were concerned, and so what were they going to do? Well, at the meetings at Versailles, Wilson and Lloyd George pledged to the French a guarantee of French sovereignty and French territory. There was to be an Anglo-American guarantee. So when the conference came to an end, these attempts to weaken Germany and then to establish a system of collective security were all in place. And yet there was trouble. Trouble almost instantly. Indeed, problems with the treaty and the system of collective security emerged at once. Predictably, this was a surprise to absolutely nobody, the Germans, regardless of their political affiliation, whether they were on the radical left from the communists or on the radical right or the conservatives, the monarchists, all German political parties thought the treaty was a dictated peace, that it was unfair, that it was an abomination. The treaty alienated the Germans. They saw it as a diktat, was the German term. It means a dictated peace. They resented all the provisions, not some of them, but all of them. Particularly, I think, the war guilt clause and the reparations. Also, the way the war ended in this curious fashion, the German army was successful, remarkably successful, in diverting responsibility for the armistice away from the army itself. It had been the army that had called for the armistice. And yet, the army managed to distance itself from the actual surrender and then certainly from the Treaty of Versailles. The responsibility for Versailles was the new Republican government that had been established by the Revolution. And so as the Germans came home from the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles where the treaty was negotiated, the stab in the back legend had already taken root. A sense that the German army, there had to be some explanation. Germany had been sold out, the army stabbed in the back. The right wing in particular in Germany was convinced of this. And this stab in the back legend, the way the war ended, the Treaty of Versailles served to delegitimize the new democratic government. The Republican government in Germany was born with a heavy burden of responsibility for something that it had not, in fact, it had not been in power during the war, whereas the Kaiser, the army, and so on managed to sidestep that responsibility. Although Germany in the late 1920s would try to fulfill the treaty, it was never accepted in Germany. Its validity was always questioned. It became simply a mantra of all political parties. That was predictable. What was not predictable, and what came as a great shock and a blow to the treaties and the international system of collective security, was that the United States Senate failed to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The United States would not become a member of the League of Nations. It was a preview of American isolationism that would dominate American policy in the 1930s. So that at the very outset, one of the major pieces foreseen at Versailles of this great puzzle, this great system, was absent. The United States failed to participate, and not only did we fail to enter the League of Nations to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, the Senate also failed to approve the Anglo-American guarantee to France. It was an entangling alliance. This was, we didn't want any part of being involved in European problems. The upshot of this was that when the United States failed to ratify the guarantee to France, so did Great Britain. Britain was not going to do it without the United States, and so at the very beginning, already by 1920, these key factors in the international system, the anticipated international system, were absent. The anticipated collective security system was gravely weakened, if not utterly undone, almost from the beginning. The United States would remain heavily involved in European financial affairs in the 1920s, but resolutely refused to enter into any sort of collective security arrangement. Collective security was also further weakened by a growing British conviction in the 1920s that the Treaty of Versailles had been, as the Germans maintained, too harsh, and that the real problem for stability in Europe wasn't the Germans who were defeated, but rather the French, the vindictiveness of the French, that the French were now going to use this opportunity to establish their hegemony on the continent. This is a theme we'll come back to in the future, but cooperation between Britain and France was not something that one could take for granted, despite their cooperation during the Great War. And with over 1 million dead and wounded in the First War, the British were extremely wary of being drawn into a new conflict. That was especially the case since the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa had become separate members of the League of Nations and were even more reluctant to be drawn into continental affairs. Britain therefore favored accommodation with Germany. The British saw the League of Nations not as an instrument to enforce the treaty, but as an instrument for reconciliation, to manage conflict, rather to enforce the treaty. Italy was embittered because it had not been rewarded with territories in the Adriatic or in North Africa. The Italians wind up technically a victor state in the First War, although they had suffered grievous losses fighting the Austrians in the south. Italy came away from the Treaty of Versailles also unhappy that it hadn't gotten these territories, former territories in North Africa or in the Adriatic. If Republican Italy, which had fought the war, was disappointed with the outcome, fascist Italy, Mussolini would come to power in 1922, was infuriated by this turn of events. There was also one other absentee at the Treaty of Versailles, and an important one. The new Bolshevik regime in Russia was not invited to the Treaty of Versailles, to the negotiations at Versailles. The Bolshevik regime in the new Soviet Union was a pariah state, an outsider. Not invited. It's the beginning, along with the Allied intervention, an attempt to roll back the Bolshevik revolution, to keep the Russians in the war. It's the beginning of a conviction on the part of the new Bolshevik leadership that the Western Allies couldn't be relied upon, that the West was not interested in real security with the Russians involved. What this meant then, at the conclusion of the decade, was that France was compelled to assume responsibility for enforcing the treaty. What had begun as an attempt to weaken Germany and to provide for a system of collective security had already, even actually by the mid-20s, resulted in a situation in which France alone felt responsible for finding some sort of workable solution to what it saw as the ongoing German problem.